lot of people say there's never been a conversation around batteries without "it depends" being said at least one time. So I'm glad we were able to say that today. It means we're on the right track. All right, let's go ahead and move on to the next section. All right, there's more to augmentation than just adding batteries. It's truly the case. All right, so here, all right, there we go. These are just some general risks that you have to consider when thinking about augmentation. So difference in voltage profiles between new batteries and old batteries. So just one thing I'd like kind of all the attendees to be aware of is, battery cells voltage will change throughout the state of charge range. So there's going to be a maximum voltage at maximum state of charge and a minimum voltage at minimum state of charge. So that voltage profile will change with time as the batteries degrade. So when you parallel a new battery with an old battery, right, you're paralleling basically two different voltages. So what happens? You start getting, charging from one to the other, you need to balance, and it's a nightmare for the battery BMS. The integrator won't like it very much. They'll lose a lot of hair over it. So it's really a big risk. And I love it when, a lot of the, planners and will assume that, oh yeah, we'll just move all the old racks together and parallel them as if nothing happened throughout the project life and all racks discharged exactly the same way, charged exactly the same way. None of your inverters went offline. It's a really, really optimistic view, but we'll get into that later when we get into the details of that architecture. All right, another thing, form factor variance. This is kind of more applicable if you're planning to just kind of buy battery racks and put them in the same building or the same enclosure. You may not need to worry about that so much if you're using kind of a single rack enclosure like the Ener1, the CATL battery solution is just one enclosure per rack. So you can just, that's not as big of a deal. But certainly if it's a ISO container or a battery building, your form factor is going to be a factor there. Another one that gets very, very often missed is difference in fire protection and safety requirements between old and new battery systems, right? We all know there's kind of a lot evolving in the fire safety space. There's been a lot that has changed in NFPA 855 over the past, I want to say, 3 or 4 years. So when you're planning an augmentation strategy, you're probably at least planning like 5 years out into the future. So it's very, very likely that we'll have different safety standards then that may affect how you're connecting your new batteries. Right, performance guarantee terms variation. So those by single source vendors, which is the case for. Yeah, so as most folks are aware, when you go out and purchase a battery system, you're purchasing it with a performance guarantee, so you have that coverage you're aware of. That is probably not going to cover future states. I find it, in my experience, we haven't found any integrator that's willing to kind of guarantee the performance of batteries that they are going to add 5 years from now, 10 years from now. So really, if you're planning an augmentation strategy, in most of the times, you're planning for that on your own. You're going to go out in 5 years, you're going to get a contract with another battery integrator, or procure the batteries yourself and have a EPC kind of install them for you. You're taking that risk on your own. There isn't many parties out there that'll, at least bankable, right, that will tell you, oh, yep, year 15, we're going to be there and we're going to be adding these batteries. You're not going to find that. So be prepared to take that risk on your own. Right. And the consideration as well, last one here is that with augmentation, you have differing capacities throughout the project life. So just plan for that, kind of like Adam alluded to, right? With AC augmentation, you're adding actual more inverters. So, you're ending the project capacity at a different power capacity than you started with. So it's not as big a deal, I think, from a technical standpoint, not an interconnection standpoint, but it's also something to be aware of. All right, so the first approach here we're going to talk about is DC augmentation, right? And I'll just call this 1A because there's a couple of types of DC augmentation. But here, what you're assuming here is that, all right, these are all the PCSs throughout the project, right? We're assuming that, all right, we have 10 inverters. At the first augmentation, the plan is we're going to take the battery racks behind that 10th inverter and just scatter them across all existing battery racks behind other inverters, right? And then the new battery racks, we're adding them behind inverter number 10. So that way, remember this first point, difference in voltage profile between new and old battery racks? That way, we didn't parallel the new battery racks with the old battery racks, right? So here, these yellow and gray racks, they're parallel together, but that's okay, right? Since, they all, they were put in service at the same time, so they must have degraded the same exact way, right? Well, no, wrong. That's a very, very dangerous and optimistic view, right? If you've operated any battery project, you're going to know that not all inverters are going to be on 100% of the time. You're going to have one inverter that goes offline for a couple of weeks, maybe a couple of months till you get that IGBT from the OEM and it gets fixed. Meanwhile, all the other inverters are operating. So at the end of the day, it is more realistic to assume that these will have varying levels of degradation and accordingly varying voltage profiles across them. So when you kind of take all these racks that have been treated kind of the same way since they're behind the single inverter, and you disperse them in parallel with the others, there is like a very probable and likely case that the voltage profile of this yellow one is different from these gray ones here. So long story short, just to summarize here, the pros and cons, the strategy reduces risk of rack voltage imbalance since old and new racks are not mixed. Augmentation involves minimal equipment type. So here, if you look at it, you're only adding battery racks, right? So that's a good thing. You're not adding any additional equipment other than just batteries. So that is an advantage. However, like we said, it's very optimistic to assume that you'll have the exact same voltage profiles across all old racks. Second on the cons list, since some inverters will have, this is actually the one we discussed. The other thing is the one we kind of touched on here as well, the form factor, right? If you're in a building, if you're using an ISO container, you're assuming that the battery racks you're adding have the same form factor as the old ones here, and that's very, very unlikely. So that concludes kind of the first augmentation approach.
Yeah, and Sharif, I just kind of want to mention, right? I gotta put in my shameless FlexGen plug here. You talk about the risk of like voltage imbalance, and you might have older cells that are degraded more than others, right? But the way to kind of mitigate some of that risk too is really through having a solid energy management system, and one that is monitoring these. FlexGen, we're collecting 15,000 data points per second on our systems, and it's taking that data, seeing what's really happening at the cell level, and then responding and sending the right commands to these cells and modules to deal with these imbalances and differences really at the cell level. So again, just kind of want to enforce that energy management system is what's dependent on balancing all of this and keeping it, you know, kosher.
Oh. Right. Yeah. Thanks, Adam, for that. Now, I'll add, you know, in the beginning I mentioned this is, you know, a DC augmentation A. DC augmentation B is where, you know, you have DC-DC converters to help you with that voltage imbalance. So the way OEMs and integrators are going about this is one of two ways. Either in the beginning of the project, they assume that they're going to have DC-DC converters behind each inverter and on each rack. So on top of each rack, you have a DC-DC converter. So really that rack could have whatever voltage profile it wanted because you have that DC-DC converter kind of taking care of the voltage imbalance between all racks that are connected to a common inverter. So that's one way. The other that is slightly similar is you'll only add DC-DC converters to the racks in which you're mixing old ones and new ones, well, or you're mixing old ones and other older ones. So here you'd be adding DC-DC converters as well. So that will kind of, you know, help you out with the voltage imbalance issue. Although something to consider with this architecture and just, you know, let's remember why we're doing this. The main purpose of augmentation is that you're trying to defer, you know, that investment into the future. So you're trying to defer capital. So with that DC-DC converter, you're kind of going in the other direction. It's as if you're adding an entirely additional layer of DC-DC converters on top of, or entire additional layer of inverters, really. Because they are on a dollars per kW standpoint, they are kind of at a similar price point. So again, it goes against the whole reason we're doing augmentation. So personally, not a big fan of this solution, but I mean, there could be cases out there, and there probably is cases that makes sense. Just depends on the use case. All right, now AC augmentation, right? So let's talk about like the architecture itself. So what are you doing here? You're just basically building out a project at year zero, right? If you're planning for it from year zero, you're just building the project and leaving space for additional inverters and PCSs to be added and battery enclosures behind them. So physically, what you would do is you would build the medium voltage collection system such that it has capacity for all the future phases you plan to add. So that's physically. You'd also account for that additional power capacity, again, for all phases in the GSU capacity, so that when you add more PCSs, you don't have to upgrade your GSU if it's transmission tied. So that's physically. Now, I guess I'll call it just logistically. If you're planning an AC augmentation from year zero, you probably want to structure your interconnection accordingly and request the full capacity of all phases. Now, different utilities may have different requirements and limitations on this from an interconnection standpoint. Some utilities may tell you, well, no, you can't actually reserve all that capacity and, you know, for 5 years and then, you know, add that capacity, you know, in the future. You have to have like the amount of capacity year zero has to match what you have your interconnection for. Other utilities may tell you it's fine, only you just have, you know, these requirements from a SCADA standpoint, from a system design standpoint, so that their system impact study results aren't invalidated when you add more inverters in the future. So it'll just differ from an interconnection standpoint. So if you're planning an architecture like this, check with your utility, but it is definitely a bad idea to plan for this strategy and just have the interconnection at the capacity of only the first phase. And then after 5 years, you're submitting another interconnection and going through that process again. A lot of risk there. So I think that covers this one, both from a pros and cons standpoint. Momin or Adam, anything to add on this one? All right. Okay, so I think with that, we can probably take a couple of questions.
Sure. Do you want me to start off with a couple that we have here?
Yes, please do, Christina. Thank you.
All right. So Alejandro Gutierrez asked, when we evaluate augmentation, we identify the risk that in the future, there are no compatible batteries for installing in the existing racks. Do you know what has the industry, if the industry, has done something to prevent this issue, or how they are tackling it?
Yeah, so different kind of entities, I'll just give my perspective here. Kind of for us as Duke Energy, we recognize that as a big risk. So with specifically with DC augmentation. So really for our projects, we're planning AC augmentations, at least right now, and we're continuously evaluating new architectures out there. It also depends, one thing to take into account and to consider is how big are your inverters, right? The smaller your inverters are, the more flexibility you'll have with kind of the riskier augmentation strategies, which in my view is DC augmentation. But really, it becomes using smaller inverters isn't very economical, especially when you're designing kind of hundreds of megawatts of projects, or your project is, I would say, like 50 megawatts and beyond. So yeah, it depends on your specific case.
Perfect. Well, thank you. Adam, Momin, would you like to also add something else, or should we move to the next question? Okay.
No, I think just to reiterate that energy management system is pretty important in being able to efficiently augment later on too. But yeah.
Perfect. Well, thank you both. So the next question comes from Huda, and she asked, how do you incorporate forecasting and modeling techniques to ensure accurate project design and performance evaluation?
Forecasting. I'm not sure if she means price forecasting or load forecasting, but I think from a modeling standpoint, at least at Duke Energy, we're trying to be as accurate as possible with modeling these battery systems and forecasting and estimating their degradation based on exactly what we plan to do with them. One of our challenges as a utility is that we operate the grid. So when we install a battery project at a certain location, and we're planning in the beginning for that battery project to, like, for example, provide backup power to a town, like, for example, our Hot Springs project in North Carolina, right? If something changes on that feeder, which happens, right? You get more load coming in, us as a utility, we have the responsibility to basically accommodate it, and it'll probably lead to a change in the use case that we're implementing for that battery facility. So maybe instead of it doing load shaving for the other 99% of the time when it's not providing backup power, and maybe now it needs to do a frequency regulation function or arbitrage function. So that was really one of the challenges we had when we were starting this energy storage program. Everyone in the industry or really developers really knew exactly what they wanted to do with their batteries because they're planning for a certain service. But us as a regulated utility, we wanted to have flexibility. So we spent months and months negotiating flexible, what is now very well known as flexible performance guarantees with battery OEMs. But that's for the execution phase, right? When you have a purchase order in hand and you're talking to a major battery OEM like Samsung or like CATL, and you're telling them we want that flexibility, they will work with you. But if you're in the design phase, which we're also doing, right, and you want to estimate, all right, for this use case, how much degradation we get versus that, that's where you kind of need a little bit more sophistication here. And that's kind of one of the major points here of the workshop, especially specifically the first optimization, where we looked at two different types of cycles and how it impacted degradation.
Yeah, and just to kind of touch on this a little bit, right? So the question is around forecasting and modeling. I mean, the modeling is what is happening here with this Storlytics tool, right? The forecasting is different, right? Sharif just gave you a perspective of how a regulated utility looks at forecasting and really how they're thinking about developing that battery usage profile. The major point of this whole webinar is that the battery usage profile can make a huge difference on your sizing and project economics, right? But so again, Sharif gave the regulated utility perspective, but there's a ton of people I'm sure on this call that are either under a toll type of agreement, you know, they're an IPP that has a toll agreement, or maybe you're operating merchant. And so from a forecasting standpoint there, you know, that's especially in a merchant market, you know, I'd recommend maybe like an Ascend Analytics or maybe a Customized Energy Solutions, who are really the experts on sort of pricing different nodes to help you develop what you think your battery usage profile is going to be to maximize revenue in wherever you're placing that battery, whether, you know, it's CAISO in the United States or ERCOT in the United States or elsewhere. We'll just kind of throw those names out there. Those kind of firms can help you develop that battery use profile that then feeds into this Storlytics tool that then also needs to be fed into, you know, more of an economic pro forma. Hopefully that's helpful in kind of shedding some light on that question.
Great. Well, next question is also from Hoda, and they ask, how do you determine the optimal sizing of the energy storage system and select the appropriate battery technology and original equipment manufacturer for a specific use case stack? I'm assuming that there's a lot of different factors that are depending on, and there's no general view, but do you have any tricks out there that they could use?
Yeah, I think kind of, well, that was kind of the main subject of this workshop, and we'll be happy to kind of share these slides afterwards. And if you review the recording, you'll see kind of optimization 1, 2, and 3 will basically specifically addresses that question. But the only thing I'll add is, you know, prior to getting into a study like that was conducted for optimization 2, where we compared EnerVenue to lithium, right? Prior to doing that, you know, as you kind of design more battery projects, you become aware of how use cases are affected by different characteristics in the battery that you use for these use cases. So if I know that, for example, right, technology like EnerVenue, right, the nickel hydrogen technology, it has a high self-discharge rate compared to lithium. So now I know that, all right, I probably don't want to use that technology for a backup power application, because in backup power applications, what are you doing? You're just basically charging the battery and waiting for an outage, right? So you don't want to have a battery technology that has high self-discharge rate in a use case like that, right? But we know it has a very, very high cycle life. So if we have a high cycling application, now we know, yeah, it's probably going to be either, you know, this EnerVenue technology or maybe another one that has a similar high cycle count. characteristics. So that's your starting point, but then you want to get into the details as we did in this workshop.
Okay. I also see in the chat, Carmina asked, what is a long-term LFP cost scenario used for modeling augmentation?
What is a long-term? I can't see that question.
Oh yeah, I see it in the chat. Yeah. So we talked about that. I'll ask Sharif if you can go back to the graphs. So it was kind of bundled together, but no, keep going back. I think one or two more. Yeah, see, so on the right-hand side, yeah, no.
Yep.
Keep going one more, Sharif.
Oh, here?
Yeah. So we assume $200 per kilowatt hour in year 5 and $160 in year 15, but that is also supposed to represent the EPC costs that you would see to, add in those batteries. So that would be LFP best plus EPC costs there. We didn't necessarily go through trying to separate them out, but.
Okay, yes, Carmina confirmed that it was answered. Yep. Thank you.
All right, I think we can take more questions here. Luckily, we have some time. I think this one, it's actually directed towards me, but Adam, since you kind of have that Duke Energy business development manager, history, I think you'd be better to answer this one. So
yeah, I can answer this. So when I said I worked for Duke, I was on the regulated utility side. And so what that means is Duke doesn't compete in a market. There is no price point to determine when you should charge or discharge. It's really like the Duke system operator decides when energy is needed or not, right? And so Duke on that regulated side means they're a regulated monopoly. Like you can't buy your power from anybody else in North Carolina, depending on exactly where you live, I should say, other than Duke, right? And the reason they get to do that is because they're regulated by, for example, the North Carolina Utility Commission. There's other southeastern states in the US are regulated like that as well. So they're allowed to make a certain return on the investments that they make to the grid and to batteries, other power generation applications. And so what Duke does on the regulated side is they have to go to that state regulatory commission and say, hey, we want to do this project. These are the benefits to the customer, and then get approval from that state regulatory commission. And so the projects that are on Duke's regulated side of the business have all been, I would say, approved by that state regulatory commission that either said, hey, this is in the best interest of the rate paying customers. Alternatively, there are storage projects on Duke's commercial side of the business, which again was just announced 2 days ago, or no, I'm sorry, it was yesterday that it was being sold to Brookfield. That side of the business is operating in competitive markets where they need to meet I would say a target IRR. The financial metrics of success are different on that commercial side versus on the regulated utility side. So just kind of want to point out that difference. Hopefully that answers the question.
Yep. Thanks, Adam. I'm very glad you're here to answer that question. I'm more on the technical side within Duke. So
yeah, that's fair. Well, I was the one in front of those. I was the one at those state regulatory meetings trying to convince them we needed to invest in batteries. And fortunately we were successful, Sharif, but it was only because you guys on the technical side designed such great battery projects.
Awesome. Thanks. All right. Let's take this next one here. Can you explain?
I can take this one. So can you explain the process of assessing impacts of energy storage project on project IRR? What you really have to do is, and I'm glad you asked this question because, Sharif and I had a conversation about this, and Sharif, you have to try to help me remember what was the metric that you were previously going for?
Yeah,
it was
we're looking at the net present value of all OPEX costs plus capital costs divided basically by end of life usable energy.
Yeah.
Very sophisticated.
So yeah, so well, and Sharif went through that sort of early on in the deck, right? But what isn't accounted for in that type of analysis, well, he did have the net present value. So net present value does take into account the time value of money. But the point is, or really the answer to the question is, you have to have a model that basically shows cash flows, both revenues and expenses over time, that can be dynamic such that when you make a change to size, it changes both CapEx and OpEx costs of those cash flows over time. And the difference when you make changes to system designs and change those cash flows, that's how you will understand the impacts of those changes to the IRR. Because essentially all IRR is a calculation of it calculates just the cash. It's just at the end of the day, the cash flow to the investor across some period of time. Is in regards to associated risks and possible mitigations, that's very contractual. So, maybe that's a good question to go to one of our last slides here, Sharif, which I think is kind of a summary getting back to, I don't know if you added any more in there. No, keep going. It's kind of like, we started with, this is a terrible investment committee slide that you would get laughed out of the room at, and not saying that this is a whole lot better, but now our mitigants are a lot more detailed, right? Before, our mitigants were, oh, well, we're just going to make sure we design it good, right? That's not an appropriate response. Now the appropriate responses are, well, our PCS sizing is sized to meet 20-year requirements without augmentation, or it's sized that we added that extra PCS inverter, as Sharif just walked through, to allow for augmentation in the future, right? And that's going to mitigate the risk of triggering a material modification later on down the road. So, that's a risk that you can either mitigate it up front, or you can assume that risk and know that you're taking that risk depending on what happens in the future. Similarly, for the battery sizing, and we walked through a lot of these, the risk of the sizing being inadequate, and then you fail the offtake capacity test. The additional consequences of that are either you're going to need to pay financially liquidated damages to that offtake agreement owner, or you're going to need to remedy the situation and go buy new cells and somehow meet that minimum requirement, right? There will be financial pain there. So to mitigate that, we now know how to overbuild and design for, we can tell the investment committee, well, this is the worst case usage scenario, the deep discharges every single day, versus maybe a better case. And either you designed a project that was maybe somewhat in the middle, and you're telling the investment committee, hey, this is the risk we're assuming, like this is the worst case. We didn't design it, or maybe we did design it to be the absolute worst case, but you can kind of present the relative risk that you're taking from an overbuild perspective based on the use case assumed. And you can prove that you're taking into account these operating characteristics. Maybe you use Storlytics or some other consultant to verify that you assume the correct state of health and depth of discharge. You're not falling below that 65% state of health percentage that Sharif mentioned, because that's at least a typical maybe warranty guardrail that we've seen. If you as long as you don't operate it out of these guardrails, which maybe your model shows, then you're backstopped by that battery warranty. If your model isn't sophisticated enough to take into account those operating characteristics and sort of guardrails that are within your battery warranty, then your pro forma model and IRR is at risk. And then finally, a point, just about layout and design, having that to consider future augmentation strategy. These are all mitigants to having an undersized BESS upfront. So hopefully that kind of answers the question and somewhat kind of ties up what we learned and how we all can kind of be better informed and provide our investors and whoever makes the kind of financial decisions at your company to design optimal battery storage projects.
I'll just add one thing on top of that. Sometimes kind of, as you look to the risks, the mitigation is just don't, right? I've been kind of puzzled by, the number of projects I've seen with, assuming a very smooth DC augmentation throughout. I've seen some strategies assuming we're going to be adding new battery racks every year. This is DC augmentation. We're just adding battery racks year over year over year. So I think that's mainly because most of the times there's not really a technical dive into really how you're going to do things. It's just more of a business review or so. But on our side at Duke Energy, we just recognizing the potential risks with the current DC augmentation strategies, we just made a decision for now to just stick with AC augmentation until we kind of get more comfortable with DC augmentation if the risks go down. But all right, I'll shift to another question by Iman. So which of these two strategies are more appropriate? Charge discharge battery from 30 to 70% state of charge for 100 times, or charge discharge battery from 10 to 90% state of charge for 50 times? And kind of like what Iman did there, if you do the calculation, I think you'll get probably the same number of equivalent cycles there, which is exactly what we did in the first optimization. We did the deep discharges and the shallow discharges, and both of them, it was one cycle a day. And I think what we found with the specific LFP battery model we utilized was that the shallow discharges were less impactful on degradation than the deep discharges. So in this case, if you're using that same battery OAM, you're probably looking at a more economical first case you have here. So going from 30% to 70% state of charge back and forth. Right, and Adam, we thought we had gotten another question by, oh, you're typing that question. Okay, great. I'll take a couple more here. All right, great analytics. We sure have come a long way since 15 years ago when we started on energy storage in California. Would new energy storage and DERMS, as well as rooftop solar plus storage and EVs, change these analytics? And also any enhancements from AI that may be expected soon? I don't know. that's just too broad of a question to, I'll be frank, to provide any kind of a meaningful.
I can maybe put a little color on that, right? So what it would change is if you add new energy storage to the California grid and DERMS and rooftop solar plus storage and EVs, it changes the market dynamics that you would potentially be compensated for. The revenues you would receive being one of those battery participants in the CAISO or California market, right? So I think that's probably the answer to your question. And the way that it changes the analytics is, in this webinar, we made it pretty simple. It was a fixed $15 per kilowatt month toll agreement. So it really didn't matter what happened in the CAISO market. You have that offtake agreement with one utility, but there's, several different players or entities that want to just participate in the merchant market where that revenue stream is going to be very variable and volatile, and it will change as additional energy storage, DERMS, rooftop solar, et cetera, are added to the grid. As far as AI, I think a lot of these trading algorithms that you see that help project owners trade their batteries in those merchant markets, I believe they're using AI technologies. I personally am not by any means an expert in AI, so I couldn't really speak to the details there, but I'd probably go to an optimizer or kind of a trading algorithm type entity to probably learn more about that.
All right. Again, Adam, I'm glad you're here. All right, let's take this next one here. What are the key factors to consider when constructing battery usage profiles for various grid services? I guess the The highest priority one I'll mention here is just to make sure you're accounting for the entire use case stack. In the beginning of this workshop, Motman talked about kind of stacking different battery applications and use cases or prioritizing them. So when it comes to degradation, as an engineer, I personally like to be more conservative. So if I think I'm going to be performing 3 use cases, I want to build that into the usage profile I'm developing. And, if I end up using less use cases or doing less of each use case, that's fine. But it's better to kind of overestimate than to underestimate the amount of usage you're forecasting. So yeah, that's one thing I'll mention there. I don't know, Motman or Adam, anything to add on that one?
Nah, I think he did pretty good.
All right. Okay, last one here. Question for the speakers. The average cost of O&M in the US for e.g. 10 megawatt hour, 2.5 megawatt system. How about 80 megawatt hour, 20 megawatt system? Do the numbers change? Oh, so the cost of O&M for different size projects. Are these reports available for balancing market forecasts, in particular for Japan? I have no idea about the last one. The first two, yep, O&M costs do vary based on the size of the system. As kind of Adam alluded to in the augmentation case here, you can see he accounted for the additional OpEx of the phases of the projects we're adding. So yes, it does depend on the capacity of the system. One portion of it that definitely depends on the capacity of the system is the cost of the performance guarantee from the battery OEM. For a battery OEM to guarantee your battery system, he's going to obviously charge more for kind of the bigger the system is, basically. But Adam is the expert on finances, so Adam, I'll check with you.
I mean, I don't, I'm not here to necessarily give out cost information, so I apologize if I didn't answer that question earlier. But, I'd say there's all kinds of different entities out there that you can get sort of costs from, at least just if you're looking for averages. If you have real projects that you're looking for quotes for, FlexGen's happy to provide a quote. But generally speaking, to answer the question, the costs are going to be very project dependent. It depends on where they are. It depends on what you're doing. It depends on exactly the services that you're looking for. That's probably how I would answer that question.
Oh, perfect. Thanks, Adam. All right, and last one we have here, and I think this one is directed towards Storlytics. So, Motman, I'll direct this one to you.
Yep.
Yeah. So will you explain again how this?
Yep. He is asking about the license, how the license works. So basically, we have three current versions of Storlytics. The trial version, which lasts for 14 days, and we have 2 other versions, the base one and the plus one. What it costs? The base one is $10,000. The purchasing price, and for the plus one is 12,000. What type? Okay, he is asking about the reports we generate. So we have basically 2 main modules in our software. The first one, the battery profile creator, and we went through that recently in the slide. So it generates one report, and it also supports the output CSV file of the simulation. On the other side, for the battery testing modular, we have it also produces the full analytical report that Sharif went through for optimization 1, the optimization 2, like the charts for the SOH and the battery degradation, and I think the diagram for the losses. So here are the 2 reports, and I mentioned the output CSV file. Yeah.
All right.
Yeah.
Thanks, Momin.
Thank you.
Okay, I think that was the last question. So we'll go to this last portion of the workshop here. Now, bringing it all in, what did we learn today, right? Wow, man, a lot of slides to go through. All right, here we go. So I'll just take these point by point. So first one here, the best usage profile heavily affects battery degradation and accordingly project size, right? And we're not talking pennies. That's, you know, we've seen in the first optimization that it made a huge difference on the beginning of life capacity between one cycle with deep discharges and another equivalent cycle with shallow cycles. So now we know that it is consequential. All right, number two here, all cycles are not created equal. So, you know, and this is again to the first optimization. We've seen the differences between the two. And number three, there is no such thing as best battery. There is a best suited battery for each use case. So depending on exactly what you plan to do with the battery, if you're in PJM, if you're in any other ISO or RTO and planning for different services, or if you're in a tolling agreement and you know how many cycles and the type of cycles, you want to use that to find the most suited battery technology for you. And as we saw in optimization 2, the financial difference and the IRR for using the right technology for the use case is in fact very, very significant. All right, the last point, the risks of certain types of augmentation cannot be ignored, right? So in optimization 3, we went through the finances, we calculated, all right, how much we're going to spend on batteries in the beginning and throughout the battery project, if we're doing augmentation, and how does that affect our IRR? But we then talked about the different risks of different architectures. So I guess some developers are more sophisticated than others. Some may have a way to, and Adam, you can kind of correct me on this, but some may have ways to tie risks to and put dollar signs on them and account for that in the financial side of things. I think, if not, then you definitely want to treat those risks as a qualitative factor and really just account for them if you plan to go with any of these augmentation strategies. But
yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, it's all about every investor is different, right? Some investors have conservative capital. They don't want to take any risks. They want to see a toll agreement. They want to see every operational risk they can backstopped by a warranty or guarantee. But that typically is going to drive, returns lower versus if you're willing to take risk, maybe it's merchant, maybe it's also you're willing to take the risk to augment later on and hope that the battery use profile isn't the worst case scenario that we showed. And then you may see higher returns later on. So, every investor and capital pool is going to be different on the risk, but it's important that you just know and can attempt to quantify them as best possible. And I think this industry still has a ways to go, but we're getting better.
Yep. Absolutely. Well, I think that kind of brings us to the end of our workshop here. So big thank you to ATA Insights for organizing everything. Big thank you to Storlytics as well for hosting this webinar. So thank you, Momin, for that. And Christina, I'll just pass it back over to you.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much, Momin, Sharif, and Adam, for a great session. I think we'll have to take a look a couple of times more and review all the slides, especially to hear Adam's take on the battery joke again. But thank you for such a great specific workshop and answering all the questions that the participants had. That was over, I think, 40 questions or so. So thank you so much. We hope to see everyone very, very soon. Although it was a 4-hour workshop, we cut it to 3. So I think that you guys were very, very effective, but we will share the slides and the recordings in a couple of days. So everyone, thank you so much for attending. And I think that's a wrap up.
Great.
So once again, thank you everyone then. Thank you, Mohammed. Thank you, Sharif, and thank you, Adam, and everyone that is there. I was still like bracing for another hour, to be honest. So we actually stored 1 more hour to do something else. There you go. Good. Thank you. See you later, guys.
Right. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.